Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Russel Gmirkin. He's done extensive work on the Old Testament, and he's written a few books comparing the Old Testament to Hellenistic text and making a case that the Old Testament is familiar with Plato, Manifou, Berossus, and other late first millennium BC text. And the books that he has written covering that topic is called Plato's Timaeus and the Biblical Creation Accounts, Berossus and Genesis, Manetho and Exodus. And he also wrote Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, which will be today's topic that we're going to be focusing on. Well, welcome to the program, Russell.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So my first question for you is, what is the first thing that you can remember that you would say is the trigger that got you on the path of comparing Plato and suggesting that Plato's works were utilized in the creation of the Hebrew Bible?
Well, I saw some parallels when I was researching Berossus and Genesis, but it seemed like such a large topic that I just put it to one side. Then a gentleman named Philippe Wadenboom wrote a book called Argonauts of the Desert, which it's an odd title, but it has systematically cataloged comparisons with Greek literature and the books Genesis through Kings. And it had a fairly extensive section on Plato's laws. He pointed out that Eusebius had already listed numerous parallels between the Mosaic Law Code and Plato. But of course, Eusebius, like everyone else in antiquity, assumed that Moses was, 1,000 years older than Plato. And so Plato must have borrowed from Moses. But Philippe, and I agreed with him, said that the reverse was probably the case. So that was really the stimulus for my own research.
What do you think are the most interesting, most powerful parallels between Plato's works and the Torah that you can think of?
Well, one of the striking features is that Plato advocated a system of 12 tribes for the ideal nation. You don't have a 12-tribe system anywhere in the ancient Near East, but it's all over the Greek world because they would rotate duties from one tribe to the next throughout the year. So there were a number of Greek city-states that were organized with either 6 or 12 tribes. That's one. Another really major one is that Plato advocated a theocratic form of government. And in support of this rule by the gods, he said that a nation should take their law codes and convince the citizenry that they were ancient and divine and had never been changed since the dawn of time, which is what we see in the Torah. But Plato also said that you should create a whole national literature in support of that whole divine government, so that everyone in the country would only have that approved holy set of texts that's all they could read. Their whole educational system was based on it, and therefore they would all adopt that worldview. So basically, Plato invented the idea of a Bible, a national literature. And that is one of the most striking things. You don't see that anywhere in the ancient Near East. You don't see that anywhere in the Greek world. It's only in Plato. And hence the title of my book, Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible.
What do you think about people that try to say that they try to defend the Torah predating Plato, and they say, well, don't we have some fragments of the little itty bitty fragments of the Torah with some verses, maybe from Numbers, maybe a couple of scraps of Exodus somewhere hundreds of years earlier, and even some will even go as far as saying, well, what about the discovery that Dr. Scott Stripling made at Mount Ebal about the curses of Yahweh? That's that dates to the late second millennium BCE. So what do you think of all of that?
Well, there are what they call the silver amulets from Ketef Hinnom that Gabriel Barquet discovered. And they're from about 600 BC. And they contain very strong parallel to the priestly blessing in the Book of Numbers. But as Barquet himself said, the amulet, the formula there is clearly an oral formula, and it doesn't point to the existence of a written text at that time. I met Barquet in Jerusalem, by the way, a great guy. But so there's one example where you do have an older parallel, but not in written form. You also have in the Elephantine papyri, you have references to the spring festival of, the days of unleavened bread, but not from a written text. And in the so-called Passover letter from Elephantine, it describes how to observe the Passover. That week is on the proper date. The customs are basically the same, but there's no Moses and no Exodus, none of the material that you find in the Bible. So you have a lot of echoes. I mean, religion is very conservative. You can have religious traditions that are preserved over 1,000 years time or more in oral form, but not necessarily written form. So you have to distinguish between what we have in writing and the ancient traditions. Sure, there are lots of ancient traditions predating the Torah, but they weren't written down. At least there's no evidence of that.
So what you're saying is it was largely oral, and then it only started getting written down way later in the game.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the Psalms, which don't reference the Exodus or Moses or any of those what I would call late traditions, they may have predated the Torah. They might be quite old. So religion tends to be very conservative, and you see a lot preserved there.
If I remember correctly, you say that the Septuagint and the Hebrew version of it, or the Hebrew Bible, they were composed simultaneously in the 3rd century BCE. Do you think that the two texts were identical, or could they have been originally vastly different from one another and only became more identical later?
I think that when we're talking about the Septuagint, we're talking specifically about the first 5 books
right.
of the Pentateuch. And according to the Septuagint studies is a big field, and there's been a lot of detailed studies, and all the studies have shown that the Septuagint is a very wooden, literal translation. So whatever they were copying exactly. Like a lot of the puns in Hebrew, they don't really come across. So no. So I think that the two texts were basically identical. They didn't converge later. Interestingly, my latest book on Plato's Timaeus shows that so Plato's Timaeus has long been accepted as a source for the Septuagint translation of Genesis 1, because some of the Greek phrasing really comes from Timaeus, which was Plato's creation account. But my book shows that Timaeus also was strongly influenced throughout Genesis 1 through 3. So it really shows that there's an identity between the underlying Hebrew and the Greek, and also Plato, that they all tell the same story.
I know that you also point out additional parallels between Plato and the Book of Genesis, and the more detailed parallels with the creation accounts. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. My latest book, which has just come out on May 3rd, it breaks a lot of new ground. Traditionally, the Genesis 1 has been considered a priestly creation account. Genesis 2 through 3 has been considered an earlier Yahwistic creation account. Two different stories created at two different times. So my latest book is going to show, though, that the two were contemporary and they both drew directly on Plato's Timaeus. Timaeus had basically two creation stories. In the start of Timaeus, this astronomer and philosopher named Timaeus is telling Socrates about his theories on how the world was created. He said there was a craftsman who created, a perfect world out of a pre-existing chaos, and he fashioned the sun in the sky, and this. Anyway, there's very extensive parallels between that creation account by the perfect divine monotheistic creator at the dawn of the universe, and Genesis 1 and Timaeus. But then Plato goes on to narrate basically a second creation story, because this cosmic monotheistic creator, everything he created was eternal and perfect and good, just wonderful, just by nature, because he couldn't create anything different because he was so wonderful. So there was a problem. Humans are not immortal. They are capable of wickedness. And so Plato couldn't have his divine creator creating humans. So this demiurge, this craftsman or creator, he delegated that to his sons and daughters. He said they were going to have the task of creating mortal life, because if they did it instead of him, then then these creatures could die, they could make mistakes. So he had basically his creation story was in two parts: the perfect creation of the cosmos, which very closely corresponds to Genesis 1, and then the creation of mortal life on Earth, which very closely corresponds to Genesis 2 and so on and so forth, and the sons of God in Genesis. So the God of Genesis 2 is not the creator God of Genesis 1. He's a dinky mortal God. He lives down in Eden. He's not omniscient. He doesn't, he has to ask Adam, what's going on here? How come you guys are hiding? He asked Canaan, where's Abel? He's not omniscient. He's not all powerful. He's located on the earth, much like the other sons of God in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. So you have, and this is very radical. This is very new cutting edge research that I'm doing. Yeah. So you have the cosmic creator in Genesis 1, and then you have these sons of God in the rest of Genesis that are of a totally different order. And Yahweh was not the cosmic God of creation. He's dinky national god, the patron god of the Jews and Israelites, but he was not initially conceived of as all-powerful, all-knowing, cosmic, so on and so forth. So it breaks a lot of ground, and and I hope that it's widely read. No one has put that obvious thesis forward before.
What do you think about Baroque Halpern when he suggested that First Samuel and the Dead Sea Scrolls is closer to the Septuagint than the Hebrew Bible? Would you say that would be additional evidence kind of reinforcing that the dating, the late dating for the Torah?
Well, yeah, I mean Samuel. That's a later book in the Greek Old Testament, so it doesn't really support the date or circumstances of the creation of the Pentateuch. But I think Davila, in his series on the discoveries in the Judean desert, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls, he pointed out that there's a small fragment from Genesis 1 that they discovered that is closer to the Septuagint than it is to the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible. So this was strong evidence that there was a version of these biblical books and the Pentateuch in specific that was circulating, that the Septuagint translated that was different and earlier than the Masoretic text that we're all used to. And that's kind of standard a standard result or conclusion now in Septuagint studies, that there's the Masoretic text, of the King James Version or whatever, and then there was some other version circulating that was a little bit older that they made the Septuagint translation from.
Would you connect Pandora opening the Pandora's box and releasing evil upon the earth? Would you connect that with Eve and the serpent and the book of Genesis? Or is there other Hellenistic parallels you had in mind with the fall of man?
Yeah, there's a number of parallels. Certainly, Pandora was one of the parallels that was used. Plato talked about the knowledge of good and evil in several of his dialogues, and he talked about how people can possess the knowledge of good and evil, and yet their passions, their appetites, their sexual drive, or wanting, seeing something beautiful, that can overcome their awareness of the difference between good and evil, and so that you can do a person with all the knowledge in the world can do a bad thing. So that is a strong theme in that story. Another Platonic element is in the book of Timaeus. Sex was compared to, he used the metaphor of eating the fruit of the tree, because the woman hungered for the produce of the man. So he uses that specific metaphor. But certainly the Pandora story, that's one element. And but there are several different strands that enter into it.
In the book of Isaiah, when it talks about the fall of the morning star, would you connect that to Theophon being because he
got too close to the sun?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, just not too long ago, they discovered a fragment, I think of Callisthenes, who's a Greek poet, that talks about the myth of Phaethon, who he had these wings of wax. He flew up too high to the sky and they melted, and he plunged to the earth. That's the Greek myth. But the language in this new fragment that they've discovered is very, very close to Isaiah, and scholars have remarked on it. They're very puzzled by it, but I think it's a strong possibility that that passage in Isaiah was using, I think it's Callisthenes, anyway, 3rd century Greek poet. There does seem to be a strong connection there.
I know that you compare the book of Exodus to Manifou, and what's interesting about Manifou is that for anyone that wants to read Manifou, at least what we have of him, Manifou doesn't appear to ever mention the Torah. When Josephus cites Manifou, he never makes mention of Manifou mentioning the Torah. And when they were writing the book of Exodus, which you say utilized Manifou, was Manifou? Do you think they viewed Manifou as like, okay, we're going to use this guy as a proto draft for the book of Exodus? Do you think they looked at it that way, or from a different angle?
Well, I think the Exodus story drew on 2 sources.
Okay.
A little bit earlier than Manetho was a Greek writer named Hecataeus of Abdera.
Okay.
And he visited Alexandria during the reign of the first king, Ptolemy I Soter, or Lagus. And he wrote a book called the Egyptica, or the History of Egypt, that explained about this new Egyptian realm that the Ptolemies were going to rule, their history, their customs, all sorts of stuff. And included in that was a foundation story that contains the first mention in any language of a figure called Moses. And in this typical Greek foundation story, he says that Moses was an Egyptian nobleman, and that since Egypt was overpopulated, they led an expedition to what's now the land of Judea, which was entirely unpopulated at the time, and that this Moses established Jerusalem as its capital, built its temple, created its constitution and laws, and things like that. So it's a typical Greek colony or foundation story, and it has Judea being founded from Egypt under the leadership of a fellow named Moses. But other than that, all the other details are widely divergent from the biblical account. It does draw on Plato's laws, interestingly, and has Moses found a nation with 12 tribes, like Plato advocated. But so anyway, you have this Hecataeus of Abdera. He basically gives the outline of the Exodus story. So the biblical authors use that. But Manetho, he wrote about 285 BC, 3 or 4 decades later. We know that he knew Hecataeus of Abdera. So in Josephus, Manetho has these 2 stories about how wicked Asiatics were expelled from Egypt into the land of Judea. First, there were the Hyksos, the shepherd kings, who were terrible. They overthrew the Egyptian gods and religions, and finally they were overthrown, and they went to Judea and founded Jerusalem and its temple. And then later on, they came back. They were invited back by Osarseph, who was a priest of Seth Typhon, the Asiatic god of chaos and destruction. And it was the same history repeating itself. Eventually, they were repelled or expelled back into Judea. So it's like a second Exodus account. Both of them have a lot of parallels to the biblical account. And the biblical account seems to be aware of those two stories in Manetho. And the thing is, Manetho says that in that second story, that Osiris, the wicked Egyptian priest who led these lepers and Hyksos into Judea, that some people said that he was the same as that Jewish figure called Moses. That wasn't part of Manetho's original story, but some people in that time were saying that Moses was that bad guy. So the Exodus takes Manetho into account, but is responding to those negative slanders in Manetho. Exodus says, the Israelites, the shepherds from Goshen, they didn't oppress the Egyptians like Manetho said. They were oppressed by the Egyptians, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of defensive. They flip a lot of Manetho to come out with their own story that's more positive towards Moses and the original people from Egypt who colonized Judea. So it really copies Hecataeus of Dea, but it also defends itself against Manetho. But it comes after both of them, in my opinion.
What do you think of Josephus's claim in Against Apion that when he read Manifou, he interpreted the history as if the Hyksos and the Jewish people are the same people? He said that the Hyksos were the forefathers of the Jewish people.
Yeah, it's understandable that he would say so. They were shepherd kings, and the biblical account says that the children of Israel living in the land of Goshen, they were placed there because they were shepherds. They had sheep, and the Egyptians didn't like sheep. The Exodus story borrowed several elements from Manetho. So Josephus, reading both of them side by side, would say, there's a lot of connections between one and the other. So that's understandable that he would create a link. But, and some people say that the biblical Exodus account is it's a historical memory of the Hyksos. But you have a lot of advocates for that. But I would say that really the biblical Exodus story is a reaction to Manetho's literary account. It doesn't really contain any historical memories at all, but it's responding to early literature. I mean, the people of Israel and Judea, they were autochthonous. They were earthborn. They lived there forever. They didn't come from Egypt. They didn't come from Babylonia. They were basically the local Canaanites who developed into the Jews and the Sumerians or Israelites. There was no exodus from anywhere, but they created these exodus stories in response to Manetho and other things that they read at a late date.
Do you think that Hecataeus's version of Moses, given that in this scenario he would be the earliest source ever mentioning somebody called Moses, do you think his version of it is historical or could be historical?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, he had a whole section in his Egyptiaca, his history of Egypt, that dealt with all sorts of stories of the Egyptians. According to him, they colonized the whole world. They colonized Greece. Sesostris went up to the Black Sea and colonized the kingdom of Colchis. He told one story that was preserved of how Belus, Belus, he led a colonizing expedition from Egypt to Babylonia, and he founded their priesthood and their laws and all of their customs. Well, we know who Belus is. That's Bel Marduk. That's the god Marduk, and that's not based on history. That's just another one of these exaggerated Egyptian claims. For the case of Judea, there was the Egyptians really had a better case for them than a lot of their claims to have invented culture throughout the whole world, because both the Egyptians and the Judeans and Phoenicians along the coast, they all practiced circumcision. So in Hecataeus, you read the claims that they learned circumcision from the Egyptians. So, at least there was a little bit of evidence to support that foundation myth.
What do you think the point was for Hecataeus to write this fictional history? What do you think his agenda was?
Well, he was repeating a lot of stories of the Egyptian priests. The priests, they drew connections between Egypt and all sorts of places around the world. They said that their gods were basically the same gods as the Greeks, but by different names, which I can understand why they would make that claim, because there was a Greek trading colony at Nitocris on the Egyptian Delta, couple of Greek trading colonies, and they lived there, and they kind of merged their gods with the Egyptian gods. You see that in Herodotus and a lot of places. So because of this religious syncretism, the Egyptians said our civilization is connected to all these other places around the world. And you also have to understand, at that time, Egypt had fallen. He had been conquered by Darius the Persian and Cambyses, and then Alexander the Great, and they were under Greek rule. And so the Egyptians, like the Babylonians and different peoples, they created this glorious vision of how wonderful their civilization was in the past, greater than their Greek conquerors. You get that in the History of Babylon by Berossus, the Indica by Megasthenes, the history of Egypt, and the Jewish literature too. They claimed to have invented a lot of things. They were a conquered people, but there's been books that have shown that in the early Hellenistic era, all these conquered nations resurrected their past in great and glorious detail to kind of get a little bit of national pride out of being subjected, ruled, conquered peoples. And so they wanted to point out all their grand accomplishments of the past. And that's part of the motivation for these stories about how Egypt colonized the whole world.
Going back to what we were talking about, what you were talking about earlier about the Septuagint book of Genesis, in Genesis, I think it was Genesis 1, you were saying, is copying in some cases the exact phraseology in Plato. Does a lot of that happen? Is there a lot of places in the Torah where it does that, where it copies the sentences either nearly verbatim or verbatim?
It's most prominent in Genesis 1, and then to a lesser extent in Genesis 2 and 3. But I think in Genesis 1, and I argue this in my new book, that in this one instance at least, these very educated Judean and Samaritan scholars who had studied Plato, who created their own story about the origins of the universe based on Plato. And they were philosophically very well read, highly educated. In this one case, in Genesis 1 at least, it appears that the actual authors were translators as well. Because some of the phrasing in Genesis 1, especially in Genesis 1 verse 2, where the world was without form and void, in the Septuagint, the Greek for that really comes comes right out of Timaeus. It comes out of Plato's writings. And all Septuagint scholars accept that it was influenced by Timaeus. So in this case, you have the authors who had read Timaeus and who had written their account in Hebrew based on Timaeus. They also were directly involved in the translation and used some of those phrases that they had originally read in Greek and kind of translated into Hebrew for the books of Genesis. They kind of reverted back to the original language of Timaeus in their translation. So I see the authors most directly involved in the translation at the start of Genesis, especially. Not so much throughout the rest of the Pentateuch.
So when Plato talks about the divine craftsman, the book of Genesis, when it talks about that man being created from clay, it kind of reminds me of Prometheus when he creates man from clay. But in the Mesopotamian creation myths, they also have that going too. They have their own versions of man being created by clay. So what I wanted to ask you is, do you think that the Prometheus myth or the Mesopotamian version of those myths influenced the book of Genesis more, or is the book of Genesis compiling them together?
Yeah, it draws on a lot of Mesopotamian as well as Greek sources. I think Prometheus is a lot more prominent in in Genesis 2, as you say, creating man out of clay. But Timaeus says that he also says that man was fashioned out of earth and fire and water, and that when he died, he would go back to those elements, which you also see in Genesis. From the ground you were created, and you will go back to it when you die. That's a bit of Plato there, but yes, I think that definitely was informed by the Prometheus myth. There seems to be some Prometheus 2 where at the end of Genesis 3 and humans are expelled from the garden, and God seems to be providing them with some elementary technology. They're going to have to go and till the soil. He teaches them how to make clothing out of skins. And Prometheus taught humankind all the arts necessary for their survival, since they were naked and subject to cold and heat, and so there's Prometheus at the end of Genesis 3 as well, and also Prometheus as part of the Pandora story. So the authors definitely knew Hesiod and the Prometheus tale. But there's also a lot of Mesopotamian material, especially in Genesis 4 through 9, with 10 long-lived generations before the flood, and the flood story itself, which comes from the Gilgamesh epic. So yeah, it's very eclectic. I can identify almost a dozen different sources that were used.
I remember that you were saying something about Ptolemy. I think it was Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, that they wanted to hide that they were talking about him in a certain critical way, so they had to misspell something involving the Greek or Hebrew equivalent of the word rabbit.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that to the audience?
Oh, sure. That's one of the arguments for the date of the Septuagint.
Okay.
The first Ptolemy, he was called Ptolemy Lagus. He was a legate. He was the descendant from, I guess, some guy named Lagus, which means rabbit in. And then after he saved the island of Rhodes, his name kind of changed to Ptolemy I Soter, which means the savior. But some people still refer to him as a legate, as a rabbit. While the rabbits in Greek tradition, well, I guess in most traditions, they're pretty promiscuous. They're very famous for their sexual exploits, I guess. Anyway, they were used, that was their reputation in Greek literature, and some people kind of, who were critics of Ptolemy I Soter and Ptolemy II, they would bring up this whole rabbit thing. Especially since Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, he married his sister, according to Egyptian custom. And so critics and people devising witty epigrams, they would bring up this whole rabbit thing. Well, when the Septuagint translation was made, they avoided that translation of the word rabbit as Lagus, because it would be insulting to the Ptolemaic kings. And and that helps date when the Septuagint was created in under Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. I talked about it a bit in my book on Berossus and Genesis, but other scholars have also cited that as an argument for the date of the Septuagint.
And that would fit in with the records, like the letter of Aristeas, the Talmud, and Josephus, saying that it was Ptolemy II that commissioned the Septuagint, not Ptolemy I.
Yeah. Yes. Which Aristobulus, the author of Pseudo-Aristeas, the letter of Aristeas, he could have gotten that from the library catalog at the Great Library of Alexandria, or the manuscript tag of the Septuagint. They invented library science in Alexandria under Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. A gentleman named Callimachus. He invented basically the card catalog. And those entries listed the author, the date, where a book was written, how many lines the book had. So that would have listed Ptolemy II as, that it was created during that time. And then Aristobulus, who wrote around 150 BC, he could have drawn on that in order to create a temporal setting for his story. Because the manuscript says it was written under Ptolemy II, evidently.
B Bear, thank you for the $5 Australian. He has a question for you, Russell. His question is, what do you think of Plato's noble lie in the Republic? That it is sometimes beneficial to tell people that the sky is father and earth is mother.
Well, the sky is father and earth is mother. Plato doesn't refer to that story in particular, but the noble lie is very interesting. Plato says that, rulers get to lie to the people. They get to be liars. The noble lie, as he described it, he said, sometimes it's permitted for the ruling class to make up stories about the distant past. They take place before we have any records, so you can't tell if it's true or false. You can't verify it one way or the other. And it's very much like Greek tragedy, where it would set these stories, Aeschylus and Euripides and whatever. They'd put on these plays that were set in the distant past, feature gods and rulers from legend, and they'd make up a bunch of stuff, and it was acceptable. It was noble. It was entertainment. Anyway, Plato said, if you tell a story that's set in the distant past, and if it portrays the gods in a positive light, then such a story, even though it's technically a lie, can serve noble purposes. It can convey ethical truths more effectively than the truth. So he said rulers, not regular people. If regular people lie, they get executed. But the rulers, they get a pass. They can create stories about the past that serve the national interests. In Republic, he particularly talked about the myth of the four metals. He said that when Athens was founded, the gods Athena and Hephaestus, they created the first Athenians out of the ground, like Prometheus, right out of the ground. And he said that they were created in four different races or peoples. One of them had a golden soul. They were the ruling class. They were the guardians. Another had a silver. They had the metal, physical metal silver built into their soul. And they were the warrior class. And then the brass and iron, they were like the farmers and craftsmen. So in this noble lie, he said that, Athenians should be made to believe this story that he's just making up right there on the spot, so that they will accept that their rulers are a different breed with this divine golden soul, that they're destined to be caretakers for the rest of us. And then he repeated the noble lie in Timaeus and Critias, where he said that the ancient Athenians, they from the very start, the gods founded their nation with a ruling class and this and that. So it's a foundation myth that he said the rulers could legitimately and ought to create to promote a citizenry that's obedient and pliant and will accept their rulers. And it's good for the country if everybody, if the people are sheep. I mean, he literally uses the sheep metaphor over and over again. So yeah, Plato was big on the noble lie, and really the foundation story in the Bible is an example of the noble lie, or noble fiction, we can call it. This great story set in the past where you can't really verify it, but it served ethical and theological purposes. Very Platonic.
When looking at the Masoretic text, the Masoretic version of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and comparing that to the Septuagint. The question that I have regarding that is, do you think, like, what do you think about the differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint? Do you think there's a lot more differences than people realize, or do you really think that it's mostly the same? And I ask this question because do you think the Septuagint, in a sense, is more the at least implying a little bit more polytheistic in the way it can be read than the Masoretic text, which is argued to be more monotheistic?
Well, textual critics who study all the different families of Hebrew texts, they distinguish between the Masoretic text and the Proto-Septuagint text, and there's a few differences. I think they're fairly minor. Sometimes the Septuagint preserves passages that have disappeared out of the Masoretic text, including in Genesis, 1 through 3. So you really have to compare all the different varieties you have to try and reconstruct what the original text looked like. But I would not say that the Septuagint was more polytheistic. Okay. You have polytheism throughout the whole Pentateuch. But in Genesis, in line with Plato's philosophy, all the gods running around on earth, they were all good. The gods in Genesis 1:26, they decide to make humans in their image, male and female. The sons of God, they marry these beautiful women and have noble, gigantic offspring. The Masoretic text, as well as the Septuagint, they don't portray that as negative in any way. And actually, throughout the whole book of Genesis, nothing bad is said about any of the gods. They all have their different realms on earth. They all get along. They all play nice, like Plato said. Plato said that the divine realm is completely good. And all the gods get along. There's no strife. He says specifically the gods are not jealous. There's no jealousy among the gods. And that continues throughout Genesis. When you get to Exodus to Joshua, it's a different story. Then you have monolatry, where ethics is redefined as worshiping one God only and attacking every other god. All the other gods are bad. All of the cults are evil. All of the adherents of other gods within the land of Judea and Israel, the promised land, they're to be exterminated or enslaved. So once you get into Exodus, then you have this strict monolatry where Yahweh is the only God to be worshipped. But that's not present in Genesis in either the Masoretic or Septuagint text. It really shows that there were two different sets of authors at work, and Genesis is more philosophical, in line with Plato's philosophy, and the rest of the Pentateuch, the temple authorities and national leaders, they weren't going to have this thing where all the gods are okay. It was a change in tone. But it doesn't have to do with MT versus LXX. It's two different sets of authors that work with different agendas, in my opinion. I discuss this a lot in my latest book.
So, final question: when you look at the 5 books that comprise the Torah, so you say that they were written simultaneously, but in a somewhat similar scenario, you do think that they were compressing older Jewish oral traditions that, in that sense, is somewhat similar to the documentary hypothesis. Could you explain to the audience the advantages of concluding in that way that the documentary hypothesis does not have the advantage in?
Yeah, the documentary hypothesis detects a number of different voices in the Pentateuch, mostly in Genesis. There's the Yahwist who preferred to call the God, Yahweh. There's the Elohist or E, which preferred the term Elohim. The priestly source also used Elohim, but it did its own priestly thing. And the Deuteronomist was a separate deal. So the documentary hypothesis is very good in identifying characteristics of these three different sources, or four different sources. But one thing that the documentary hypothesis always had, which was just a naked assumption, is that these different authors, J, E, D, and P, that they all wrote it centuries apart, different versions. J was first, and then E came along. E didn't kick out J, he just added to J, and then the Deuteronomist came in, and then the priestly source, he didn't, even though he disagreed with the other sources, he didn't overwrite them, he just added on. So I really accept most of the arguments that there are all these different voices at work, but I see them as multiple authors that are contemporary. They're at Alexandria. There's, the legend said there were up to 70 of them. I don't think there were 70, but there were a few, and they all had competing agendas, but they all collaborated on the creation of this text. And these different sources, they're intertwined. Sometimes J uses E and E uses J. J uses P and P uses J, so on and so forth, which drives the biblical critics crazy because none of them agree as to which came first because they're all using each other. So the advantage of my scenario is, or hypothesis, is that they were all contemporary.
Right.
Sometimes two of them would combine efforts on the same biblical passage, or sometimes they'd use one and then the other and back and forth, and really makes a lot more sense of the data, I think.
Well, thank you for joining me. I really enjoyed this show, and I definitely would like to have you come back at some point to focus specifically on your other book, one of your other books, Berossus, Manetho, Exodus, and what was the last? I forgot the full title of it.
Yeah, it's like a paragraph long.
Yeah. Here it is. Yeah, Berossus and Genesis, Manifou and Exodus. That's it. I remember now. Yep. Well, thanks again.
Yeah. Glad to be here. Nice talking to you.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream.